Russia's most heavily defended airspace is about to be beaten by a trick older than radar itself. A swarm of Ukrainian drones is crawling toward a refinery outside the Russian capital, and the officer watching them thinks he already knows how this morning ends. He's wrong. What happens in the next 10 minutes will cost his side more than it will ever admit, and it will take his own air defense network apart piece by piece. Just before dawn, a major stationed at one of the air defense posts ringing the Russian capital watches 24 slow contacts crawl onto his scope. Fixed-wing shapes, barely faster than highway traffic, holding a straight line for the refinery complex behind him. His radar puts them 11 minutes out, maybe 12, before the leading edge reaches the tank farm his post exists to protect. His crews are trained for exactly this: track the wall, engage the wall, thin it down before it arrives. But the major doesn't reach for his missiles first. He reaches for something else, and that single decision is about to shape everything that follows for the rest of the morning. Instead of opening fire, the major orders his jamming trucks to flood the navigation band the drones rely on, not aimed at the drones themselves, but at the empty air around them. He leaves one corridor clean and buries every other frequency in noise, betting that a drone which loses its signal will drift toward the only quiet channel left instead of holding its course. For a few seconds, nothing changes. Then the lead drone's track bends a degree, then two. The one behind it follows, and within half a minute the whole front edge of the swarm has curved away from its original heading and is drifting toward an open field to the south, the one stretch of sky he deliberately left untouched. He didn't destroy their guidance. He just made every other direction look worse than the one he chose for them, and herded 24 contacts into a box where his own weapons can work without dropping wreckage on the districts behind it. The box fills, but the major holds his ground fire, because the airspace above it is about to get crowded with his own aircraft. A fighter is already rolling in from altitude, and a pair of attack helicopters are dropping low to work the drones from underneath. Put a jet, 2 helicopters, and ground-based missiles into the same patch of sky at once, and one of them ends up shooting down a friendly by mistake. So the post commander stacks the engagement into layers instead. The jet takes the top, the helicopters take the deck, and every ground battery holds its fire as long as there is a friendly aircraft anywhere over the box. Nobody crosses into another team's lair, and nobody on the ground fires a shot until the sky above the drones is clear again. High over the trap, a MiG-35 punches through the first contact and keeps climbing, carving a wide arc before it can turn and line up the next one. This is one of Russia's sharpest interceptors, carrying a radar that can track dozens of contacts out past 100 kilometers and a rack of R-77 missiles slung under its wings that reach out roughly 110 kilometers, guided most of the way by the jet's own radar before switching over to a small onboard seeker for the final approach. On paper, that is an enormous mismatch against a target flying barely 160 kilometers an hour. In practice, the mismatch works against the jet instead. The fighter is moving so much faster than its prey that it flashes past the wreck almost before the pilot can line up the next shot, and all that speed has to bleed off in a long, wide turn before he can even point his nose at another contact. One pass, one drone down, and a costly detour just to come back around for the next. Down at rooftop height, the fight looks completely different. A K-52 gunship slides in beside the low drones instead of blowing past them, matching their speed and their altitude, and simply staying there, hosing them one after another with its 30mm cannon at close range. 12 tons of helicopter, built to hover and hold position rather than sprint, cruising at barely 260 kilometers an hour. Where the jet speed worked against it at altitude, the helicopter's low speed is the whole advantage here. It can sit beside a target instead of screaming past it, and take its time lining up every shot. For close to 10 minutes, this looks like exactly the kind of morning the post commander was trained to expect. Every cockpit is reporting clean kills, the count on the major screen keeps climbing, and none of his own aircraft have taken so much as a scratch. The wall of drones on the major's scope isn't shrinking, no matter how many his aircraft knock down. He leans into the screen, waiting for the number still inbound to finally drop. It doesn't move. For every drone the jet and the helicopters put down, the crowd behind it keeps grinding forward at the same pace, as if the losses aren't costing the swarm anything at all. Around the 40th kill, the jet's missile rails run dry, and the helicopters thumb their last rounds into the last row of drones before breaking off to rearm. Not one Russian aircraft has been touched all morning. Every one of them has simply run out of ammunition, and the major scope is still full of contacts. Only then does the picture become clear, and it isn't a good one. Most of what his aircraft just spent an entire warload destroying were never real threats to begin with. Stripped-down decoy airframes, some carrying no warhead at all, built around nothing but a small radar reflector rigged to throw back an echo that looks exactly like the real thing on a scope. Each one cost a fraction of a single air-to-air missile, and the jet alone just burned 5 of them on a stream of plywood and empty reflectors. A single interceptor's entire loadout, worth more than the wave it was fired into, spent on targets that were never going to reach the refinery in the first place. The major runs the numbers in his head and doesn't like where they land. His fighter is climbing away to rearm with an empty rack, his helicopters are turning back for fuel and ammunition, and every one of them needs the better part of half an hour on the ground before either can fly again. For the next 30 minutes, whatever is still heading for the refinery is going to arrive with nothing overhead to meet it. And 8 kilometers back, with the sky over the corridor finally swept clean of Russian aircraft, the wave that was never meant to be shot down at all is already crossing into the approach. The major throws every jammer he has left at the new wave, exactly the setup that flattened the first one, and nothing happens. These drones don't drift off their heading, don't hunt for a quieter frequency, don't react to the noise at all. They grind straight toward the refinery as if the jamming isn't even there. This is a different airframe entirely, and understanding why it ignores the same trick that worked minutes earlier is the whole story of what happens next. It runs over 4 meters long, with a straight wing spanning nearly 7, closer in size to a small private plane than to anything most people picture when they hear the word drone. A piston engine sits in the tail, driving a propeller that pushes the airframe forward instead of pulling it, which frees up the nose to carry a warhead instead of a motor. Roughly 300 kilograms of it is fuel and explosive, cruising at a steady 160 kilometers an hour toward a target it plotted before it ever left the ground. Instead of relying on a satellite signal at all, it counts its own turns and its own speed continuously from the moment of launch, building up a running estimate of its position with no outside signal to jam in the first place. Every few seconds, it also checks that estimate against a stored map through a small onboard camera, matching what it sees on the ground below to what it already expects to see there. There is no corridor to herd it into, because it never needed a beacon to find its way in the first place. It had the entire route memorized before the major ever turned his jammers on. 2 ground crews scrambled to the last line of defense, standing between this second wave and the tank farm. One is a Pantsir missile system parked on raised ground, radar spinning and missile rails already loaded. The other is a squad on foot nearby, shoulder-fired launchers up and scanning the same stretch of sky. Both crews have spent the morning listening to the aircraft overhead calling clean kill after clean kill. And now that channel has gone quiet. They check the sky behind the inbound contacts and find it empty. No jet, no helicopters, nothing left to thin the wave before it reaches them. Every drone on their scopes looks identical to every other one, and there is no way from where they stand to tell a decoy from a warhead by sight alone. Both crews are about to run into the same underlying problem from 2 completely different angles, and neither of them has time left to solve it cleanly. The Pantsir's flat radar panel can hold every drone in the swarm on its display at once, sweeping its beam electronically instead of physically turning to keep up. The limitation isn't seeing the targets. It's steering a missile onto one of them, which means locking a beam onto a single contact and holding it there all the way to impact. And the system can only manage 2 of those locks running at the same time. 2 open channels against 24 contacts crossing the same short stretch of sky. The crew fires, connects, reloads, and fires again. But every drone that crosses during a reload is one nobody engaged at all, and there's no way from the radar picture alone to know which of those uncontested crossings was actually carrying a warhead. On foot nearby, a gunner gets a tone, fires, and watches the missile corkscrew past a drone that is already too close for the shot to matter. The seeker on his launcher needs roughly half a kilometer of open air after leaving the tube just to arm itself and settle onto a target. And by the time his lock finally steadies, the drone has often already closed inside that distance. Effective out past 3 kilometers, useless inside the last few hundred meters. And the gunner who waits for a clean tone is the one who watches his target slip in underneath the entire weapon. His second launcher does better, dropping a drone into a field with a clean shot, but reloading, reacquiring, and waiting out a fresh tone costs several seconds every single time, and more than one contact crosses his sector untouched in exactly that gap. The surviving drones reach the refinery within minutes, and everything still standing opens fire at once. Magazines half emptied by decoys earlier in the morning, no aircraft left overhead to thin the approach, and thickening smoke starting to work against the defenders in a way nobody had planned for. Every crew on the ground is now fighting the same battle the Major fought an hour earlier, but with far fewer resources left to fight it with, and far less time to figure out which contact matters before it's already overhead. One drone slams into a steel mesh net strung high above the fuel units and detonates short, exactly as the net was built to catch it. Then the burning wreckage it just stopped falls straight down and ignites a fire of its own on the ground beneath it, turning a successful intercept into the spark for the very damage it was supposed to prevent. A Pantsir crew lines up one last close-range shot through the haze, but the radar track is smearing in the clutter, and the system automatically falls back to a secondary heat-based sensor to finish the job. That sensor washes out into a solid wall of white the moment it switches on, blinded by a refinery fire already burning far brighter than any drone engine it was built to detect. The crew fires anyway on a track they can barely hold, and a missile that misses at this range doesn't simply vanish. It comes down somewhere, and in this case, that somewhere is another fuel tank, adding a self-inflicted blast to a morning that started with a plan the Major genuinely believed in. None of it was a single failure. It was every small cost from the whole morning arriving in the same place at once. A warload spent on decoys an hour earlier, a backup sensor blinded by fires the swarm had already lit, missiles built to gut a fighter jet instead punching through plywood, and a last shot rushed through smoke that should never have been fired at all. Each layer of the defense did roughly what it was designed to do in isolation, and the gaps only opened up once every layer was forced to work at the same time, against the same swarm, with none of them able to lend the others any support. The lesson this scenario leaves behind is a simple one. Even the most expensive air defense network in the world can be beaten by simple arithmetic. When the interceptor firing costs more than the target it's chasing, and when a handful of cheap decoys can buy the real strike everything it needs to get through clean. Now picture the same morning with one detail changed. What happens if the Major reads the decoys correctly in the first 10 minutes and holds his jets and helicopters back instead of committing their entire loadout early? Maybe he lets the first wave through untouched, saves every missile for the second one, and lets the ground batteries handle the cheap airframes with cannon fire instead of six-figure interceptors. Does the second wave still make it through the corridor in that version, or does the whole trap collapse the moment his fighters stop taking the bait and save their missiles for the airframes that actually matter? There's another branch worth considering too. What if the ground crews had known in advance which contacts were decoys, freeing the Pantsir's two locks to work exclusively against real threats from the very first minute? That single piece of information might have been worth more than every aircraft the Major had in the air that morning. But before we get to that, if this breakdown was worth your time, a like and a subscribe genuinely helps the channel keep making these. That's the version of this fight nobody in this scenario had to plan for, and it's worth thinking through on your own before the next video answers it. If you want to see how these two platforms look in a straight engagement without any decoys involved at all, that breakdown is coming soon on this channel. For now, that's how this one plays out. Let me know in the comments which side you think wins if the Major calls the bluff early instead of falling for it. And subscribe if you want to catch the next scenario the moment it goes up.